Before we begin, make sure to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. It helps us bring you more real cases, deeper investigations, and stories that deserve to be told. This is Beyond the Case. On a quiet morning in the small rural town of Newaygo, Michigan, a father returns home after working the night shift. He opens his front door expecting to hear the soft stirrings of his teenage daughter, Shannon, her music playing, the dog padding down the hallway. Something, anything. Instead, the house is silent. It is the silence that will haunt him. And it is the silence that will shape an entire community's memory of that warm summer in the late 1980s. For nearly 3 decades, the truth will remain hidden, buried deep in the woods, whispered in teenage circles, and locked behind fear, loyalty, and secrets no one dared to voice aloud. Today, we revisit the disappearance of 18-year-old Shannon Siders, a case that began on a summer night in August of 1989 and would not find resolution until many, many years later. This is the story of a determined father, a frustrated community, and a truth that refused to stay buried. This is Beyond the Case. Newaygo sits among dense Michigan forests, winding rivers, and quiet roads. It is the kind of place where the night sky feels impossibly wide, and neighbors often know each other's routines better than their own. For Bob Siders, life was simple and shaped entirely around his daughter, Shannon. After Shannon's mother left when she was young, Bob stepped into the role of both parents, guiding his daughter through childhood with a mix of patience, humor, and a deep commitment to keeping her safe. By the late 1980s, Bob was working long, exhausting shifts at a local bottling plant. He often started work at midnight, returning home in the early morning light-tired, but always eager to check on Shannon. He trusted her. He knew she was responsible. And like many teenagers, Shannon had been spending more time with friends, forming her own social circles, and navigating the space between childhood and adulthood. It was the evening of August 17th, 1989. Summer break was nearing its end, and teenagers in town spent their nights cruising back roads, gathering at familiar spots, or hanging out in small groups. Shannon planned to spend the evening with friends. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary. Her father left for work shortly before midnight. The house was quiet, the porch light glowing faintly over the front yard as Bob locked the door behind him. When he drove down the dark road toward the bottling plant, he had no idea it would be the last time he would see his daughter alive. Bob arrived home in the early hours of August 18th. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light across the small living room. Something felt wrong immediately. No movement, no footsteps, no dog greeting him at the door. At first, he told himself she was simply out with friends. Maybe she stayed the night at someone's house. Maybe she overslept. But Bob knew his daughter. And a father's intuition does not whisper, it rings. He waited. He called out for her. He searched the house. And by mid-morning, the fear had settled into his stomach like stone. When hours passed with no sign of Shannon, Bob took action. He began contacting people. He reached out to Shannon's friends. He drove through town, retracing roads she often traveled. He was determined, and he refused to sit still. As days passed with no leads, Bob printed missing person flyers and distributed them everywhere he could. Gas stations, grocery stores, community boards. He sent copies to police stations all across the state of Michigan. Locals recall seeing Bob tirelessly placing flyers around town. He was not simply a worried father. He was a desperate one. But weeks passed, and then months. The community moved through the rhythms of daily life. But the absence of Shannon left a shadow hanging quietly over Newaygo. Her friends spoke with police. Rumors circulated. Stories changed. And the truth remained out of reach. Labor Day weekend, early September 1989. 2 individuals walking deep inside a forest area known locally as the Hole in the Woods, a secluded spot where teenagers often gathered, noticed something unusual on the ground. Cards. Identification. With Shannon's name. Narrator. The location was remote, the type of place only locals truly knew. When Bob heard where the items had been found, He recognized the spot instantly. He had been there himself as a teenager, but he had no idea that it was somewhere his daughter or her newer friends visited. This find changed everything, and yet gave no real answers. Police searched the area thoroughly, but at that time, they found nothing else. And so the case cooled. Not forgotten, just frozen. Time is both a healer and a thief. The 1990s became the 2000s. Seasons changed, people aged, memories faded, witnesses moved, married, started families, or drifted away. But for Bob, time stood still. He never stopped thinking about Shannon, never stopped hoping for closure, never stopped wondering what happened in those woods. And then, in a different season, in a different year, a hunter walking through the red pine plantation just beyond the tree line came across something that would shift the entire case. A discovery that would bring police, medical examiners, investigators, and the community back into a story that had been dormant for far too long. A discovery that confirmed what Bob feared every day since that morning in August 1989. Shannon was never coming home. It was a cool morning, years after Shannon had vanished, when a hunter walked into the red pine plantation, a dense, organized forest where rows of tall pines stretch endlessly toward the sky. Hunters and hikers knew the area well. Locals passed through it regularly. But on this morning, something caught the hunter's attention. A shape in the distance, something out of place among the needles and quiet earth. He paused, took a few steps closer, and realized he had stumbled upon something that would reopen a case the community had long considered unsolved. He left the woods and drove straight to the Michigan State Police post. Within hours, investigators were on site. The red pine forest was sealed off, and a discovery long hidden beneath seasons of falling needles and silence was finally uncovered. It was confirmed. Human remains, and soon, the heartbreaking truth. They belonged to Shannon Siders. For her father, the news was devastating, the worst outcome, delivered years too late. But for investigators, it meant something else. A case long dismissed as a cold mystery now demanded answers. Word spread quickly across Newaygo. Residents who once believed Shannon had simply run away now confronted a truth they never expected. Her disappearance was no longer a matter of speculation, it was a confirmed tragedy. The small-town atmosphere changed almost overnight. People whispered in grocery store aisles. A sense of unease settled into local diners and gas stations. The idea that something terrible had happened so close to home, in a familiar forest, was unsettling for everyone. And with the discovery came new questions. Who was responsible? How did it happen? Why had it been hidden for so long? Shannon's father wanted answers. The community wanted answers. Investigators knew they needed to approach the case carefully. Decades had passed, but memories, if guided correctly, could still lead to truth. Nearly 25 years after Shannon vanished, a new administration within the Michigan State Police decided to reopen several unsolved cases, including Shannon's. A special cold case task force was created. These were experienced investigators, trained to re-examine forgotten evidence, interview old witnesses, and connect dots others may have missed. Their first step was simple: rebuild the timeline of Shannon's last night. Piece by piece, interaction by interaction, interview by interview. Every person who had been mentioned in the original investigation, all 8 teenagers who last saw Shannon, was located and contacted again. Some had moved out of state. Some were still nearby. Some were hesitant to revisit old memories. But the task force persisted. By revisiting the original police reports, investigators identified the group Shannon was with on the night she disappeared. These were teenagers whose evenings revolved around driving backroads, meeting at local spots, and socializing. From interviews, 2 names consistently surfaced: Paul Jones and Matt Jones, brothers who had been part of the same social circles during that summer. The group reported that Paul and Matt were the ones who gave Shannon a ride that night. Their claim at the time was straightforward. They said they dropped her off at home sometime around midnight or shortly after. Investigators in the late 1980s retraced that route, visited the Siders' home, examined the angles, checked the lighting, and even confirmed details the brothers mentioned: porch light on, television visible through the window, the family dog moving around the house. At that time, the brothers' accounts were not contradicted. Their stories were consistent, and they passed polygraph examinations. But decades later, the cold case team did not see their statements as final. They saw them as the beginning. Among the details that resurfaced in the case files was something investigators had intentionally kept quiet during the original investigation: Shannon's class ring. She wore it frequently. Family and friends confirmed it was important to her. Yet it was missing, not found at home, not found near the remains, not found anywhere. This detail was never made public. That meant one thing: if anyone, anywhere, claimed to have seen Shannon's class ring after she disappeared, that information could reveal a connection no one expected. And that is exactly what happened when investigators re-interviewed a woman named Lindsay, a friend from those teenage circles. Lindsay told detectives that years earlier, not long after Shannon disappeared, she had seen a girls' class ring inside a car ashtray belonging to one of the Jones brothers. She recalled questioning him about it, and she remembered his reaction: unsettling, dismissive, and unusual. Her memory became one of the most important early breakthroughs in the cold case investigation. While Lindsay's account was important, it was not enough on its own. The cold case team needed more, something that could place Shannon with someone during those critical hours and provide clarity on how the night unfolded. That clarity arrived through someone named Jenny, a woman who knew many people connected to the case but had not been part of Shannon's group that evening. Jenny reached out after years of silence, ready to share something she had never fully articulated. She explained that on the night Shannon disappeared, she was riding with someone else entirely, a young man named Dean. The two were driving around the common backroads when they approached a parked car. Dean recognized the driver. He briefly stepped out to speak to him, and Jenny overheard the driver introduce himself by a familiar last name, Jones. But what unsettled her even decades later was what she overheard afterward. The driver said he was looking for a girl. That sentence lingered with her for years. And now, telling investigators, she finally voiced what she had kept inside. She believed the girl they were searching for was Shannon. With interviews from Lindsay, Jenny, and others, the cold case team began piecing together what likely happened that night. Shannon left friends at some point. She got into a car with the Jones brothers. There was a disagreement or unexpected situation. At some point, she attempted to leave or seek help. Jenny and Dean's account suggested that Shannon may have gotten away from the brothers temporarily. The idea that she had tried to escape, that she had been trying to find safety, reshaped investigators' understanding of the timeline. The brothers were now seen as individuals who may have been searching for her on rural roads. The new interpretation raised a critical question. If Shannon fled from a dangerous situation, then who else might have seen something? Who else might have driven past? Who might have heard something that night? The cold case team expanded its interviews across anyone who had been in those areas during that time period, including people who had not spoken up originally. And then, another recollection surfaced, one that brought investigators closer to understanding what occurred in those woods. Jenny told investigators something else. She and Dean eventually drove past the same remote area again. This time, she saw two individuals standing near a vehicle, and on the ground nearby was a person who appeared unconscious. She did not know, at the time, who that person was. But Dean did. According to Jenny, he stepped out of the car to help and instantly recognized the person on the ground. It was Shannon. Fear took over. Dean realized they were witnessing something serious, something far beyond a simple argument among teenagers. Jenny recalled fear in Dean's voice as he urged her to stay inside the car. The situation escalated quickly, and the two decided they could not intervene safely. But their memories, despite the passing years, remained deeply imprinted. Their statements did something investigators had not been able to do for decades. Place people at the scene. Place Shannon at the scene. Place a timeline inside the forest. This was the missing middle chapter of a story that had remained silent far too long. The statements from Jenny and Dean were more than memories. They were a turning point. For the first time, investigators had a direct timeline, a location, and individuals placed in the same area as Shannon during the crucial window of her disappearance. Cold case investigators knew they needed to revisit the events of that night with a clearer lens. The story that had once seemed simple, a teenager dropped off at home, no longer aligned with the emerging picture. Something else happened. Something unspoken. Something that remained buried as deeply as the truth itself. The case, once cold, was warming quickly. By this point, more than 2 decades had passed since Shannon's disappearance. Memories fade with time, but they also crystallize in certain moments, especially moments tied to fear, confusion, or shock. What made this cold case unique was the number of people who remembered just enough to help investigators piece together the night of August 18, 1989, but had never spoken about it in detail. Some held on to their memories because they feared conflict or retaliation. Others believed their recollections were too small to matter. Some never wanted to be entangled in a police investigation. But the cold case team approached gently, respectfully, and systematically. Their goal was to give every witness a safe space to share what they had seen or heard. Little by little, the truth came together like a mosaic, small tiles forming a larger image. A clearer narrative was emerging. The cold case task force began breaking the night down into segments. Segment 1. Shannon spends time with her social group. Segment 2. She leaves with the Jones brothers, expecting to go home. Segment 3. Something happens during the ride, something that causes Shannon to feel unsafe or distressed. Segment 4. She leaves the vehicle. Segment 5. The brothers begin driving the rural backroads, searching for her. And Segment 6, the most haunting, supported by Jenny and Dean's account. Shannon is found in a vulnerable state, and the people around her do not take her to safety. This reconstruction did more than fill in the gaps. It provided investigators with a workable theory of events, one supported by recollections, timelines, and newly rediscovered testimonies. The cold case team prepared to move deeper. Into the woods, into the relationships, into the truth. Investigators returned to the red pine plantations with fresh eyes and new information. The forest had changed over the years, trees grew taller, brush expanded, and paths were no longer as they once were. But the area remained quiet, still, and heavy with the weight of the past. Cold case detectives walked the forest floor, tracing old footpaths and mapping out where key events might have taken place. They studied distances between roads and clearings, areas where cars could park unseen, and natural breaks in the landscape where someone might stop. The investigators needed to understand how the events of that night could unfold in such an isolated place and why it took so long for remains to be found. The geography began to make sense. Everything was remote. Everything was hidden. Everything was quiet. In a forest like that, even loud moments could go unheard. Cold case investigators decided to widen their interviews beyond the original 8 teenagers. They spoke with former classmates, members of the community, people who had driven through rural roads during late-night hours, anyone who remembered something unusual around the time Shannon disappeared. Some residents recalled hearing rumors that never made sense back then. Some remembered seeing vehicles parked along forest edges. A few remembered individuals acting nervous or withdrawn in the months after Shannon vanished. Most of these memories were not enough to stand alone, but when placed next to each other, they formed patterns. The cold case team collected every detail, no matter how small, and reanalyzed them with modern investigative methods. Every story, every sighting, every moment someone hesitated in their recollection became part of the larger picture. With more information available, investigators knew it was time to revisit Paul and Matt. The brothers had both given statements in 1989 and passed polygraph tests at the time. But now, with new testimonies and a more complete timeline, investigators wanted to speak with them again, not to accuse, but to verify. Cold case specialists approached the interviews with caution and professionalism. They asked where the brothers had driven that night, at what times, and who else they may have seen. The brothers maintained their original story. They claimed to have dropped Shannon off at her home, but now their timeline did not match the new evidence gathered from others. Witnesses had placed them on rural roads later that night. Witnesses had overheard the brothers asking if others had seen a girl. And the class ring, still missing, still unaccounted for, grew in importance. The cold case team did not confront them aggressively. They simply compared statements to facts, and the inconsistencies began to accumulate. Throughout the investigation, the missing class ring remained one of the most significant pieces of withheld evidence. No one outside the original detectives and a handful of early investigators knew it was missing. The fact that Lindsay remembered seeing a ring in a car ashtray, and that the comment connected to that ring was dismissive and alarming, provided something investigators desperately needed. A detail only someone closely connected to Shannon during her final hours could have known. The ring served as an invisible thread tying together motive, opportunity, and presence. But the task force still needed stronger, more definitive connections, and that's when another unexpected testimony surfaced, this time from someone who had spent years wrestling with what they witnessed. Dean, who had once driven the rural roads with Jenny, agreed to a more extensive interview. He had stayed silent for years, not out of indifference, but out of fear and uncertainty. He had always believed that what he saw was too complicated, too frightening, or too hard to understand. But now, with investigators revisiting the case respectfully, he found the courage to share everything he remembered. Dean described seeing individuals standing near a car, noticing someone lying on the ground, and the shock of realizing it was Shannon. He explained how overwhelming the situation felt in the moment, how unprepared he was as a teenager to intervene or report it properly. Investigators treated him with empathy, understanding that trauma often freezes a person in time, leaving them unsure how to act. Dean's full account became a cornerstone of the cold case. It aligned with Jenny's observation, Lindsay's memory, and the inconsistencies in the brothers' statements. The narrative of that night, once fragmented, was beginning to take shape with clarity. At this stage, the task force had accumulated interviews, sightings, geographic mapping, and timeline reconstruction. They laid out everything on a large board, a puzzle formed from decades-old memories and carefully preserved reports. Each testimony was matched against the others. Each time frame was compared. Every route was plotted. And slowly, unmistakably, a single story began to emerge. Shannon did not vanish on her own. She did not walk home. She was not dropped off safely. She encountered danger and did not receive help in time. This realization brought investigators to a critical point. They needed to determine whether the evidence was strong enough to move forward. Still missing physical evidence. The class ring, a solid confession. But what they did have was powerful. A timeline supported by multiple witnesses, inconsistencies in key statements, and people who had held on to the truth for years, finally ready to speak. By now, investigators had reshaped the entire landscape of the case. What once seemed like a dead end had become a network of connected memories and small revelations, each one shedding new light on Shannon's final hours. The cold case task force reviewed every statement again. They looked for contradictions. They checked for new alignments. They revisited the original files with a sharper lens. What they found was striking. The story from 1989 no longer held up in two key areas. First, the timeline did not match. Second, witness accounts, once scattered and unconnected, were now corroborating each other more clearly than ever before. Something had happened that night. Something that multiple people had sensed, seen, or heard, but never fully voiced until decades later. The investigation had momentum, and momentum, in a cold case, is everything. Many viewers wonder, how can so many people keep quiet for so long? But cold case detectives understand a simple truth. Silence is often shaped by fear, confusion, uncertainty, and the belief that speaking up will only make things worse. In a small town, especially among teenagers, social pressure is powerful. Kids protect each other. Friend groups form invisible boundaries, and rumors can spread faster than facts. For years after Shannon's disappearance, many witnesses were young, unsure, or deeply affected by what they had seen. Some believed their information wouldn't matter. Others didn't want to be dragged into something painful. A few were afraid of retaliation or conflict. It wasn't indifference. It was the complicated human response to trauma and fear. But decades later, as adults, they felt differently. People who once stayed silent were now ready to talk, ready to be honest, ready to share what they had carried for too long. The cold case team continued interviewing individuals connected to the night Shannon vanished. Each conversation added another layer of depth. Some witnesses remembered a car parked in an unusual place, voices carrying across wooded areas, people acting strangely in the days after the disappearance. No single detail was enough by itself, but together, they began to tell a story that aligned with the emerging timeline. It became clear to investigators that the events of that night were not random. They unfolded in stages, step by step, moment by moment, and nearly every part of that path led back to the same location. The secluded forest, the remote gathering spot, the same place where the remains were eventually found. This pattern was impossible to ignore. Cold case detectives began laying out a full visual reconstruction, a map showing the roads, the turnoffs used by local teenagers, the quiet trails leading deeper into the wooded areas, the clearings where cars could pull off undetected. The map was more than geography. It became a blueprint of the truth. Investigators realized something critical. The location where the remains were found was not a place one would simply stumble upon. It required intention or familiarity. Someone had to know where that trail led. This meant that whoever was involved that night knew the backroads, knew the secluded paths, and knew how to move through those woods without attracting attention. This was not a stranger's route. It was a local route, a route teenagers in Newaygo described as a common if secretive place to gather, talk, or hang out away from adults. That detail changed everything. The cold case team shifted its attention to understanding the dynamics within the teenage group. They examined who trusted whom, who had conflicts, who had close friendships, who might have been afraid to speak out. People rarely hide the whole truth. More often, they hide certain pieces, the pieces that scare them, or make them seem vulnerable, or involve someone they know personally. Detectives learned that Shannon was friendly and kind, but she wasn't necessarily close with every member of the group she hung out with that night. Some people were casual acquaintances. Some were friends of friends. Others were individuals she had known for only a short time. Understanding these dynamics helped investigators determine which memories were reliable, which connections mattered, and which details were being minimized or distorted. Teenage relationships can be messy, but they can also leave lasting impressions. The more the task force understood the social landscape, the clearer the puzzle became. As details solidified, investigators recognized a striking pattern. Nearly all the accounts, even those that contradicted each other in small ways, agreed on 3 core points. 1. Shannon was not dropped off at home that night. 2. She separated from the brothers at some point, and they were searching for her. 3. Multiple witnesses independently placed the brothers near the forested area during the critical time window. When several independent sources connect the same people to the same location at the same time, and when those connections align with evidence, the case becomes stronger. And that is what was happening here. Even without graphic details, even without full clarity, the weight of consistency made the emerging truth impossible to overlook. What happened in those woods was not an accident or random misfortune. It was the result of a chain of events set in motion by specific individuals whose actions shaped that night. Investigators were getting close, very close. For Shannon's father, Bob, the renewed investigation brought mixed emotions: hope, fear, resurfaced grief, and the weight of nearly 3 decades of uncertainty. Bob had lived with unanswered questions for so long that revisiting the past was both painful and necessary. Detectives kept him informed gently, respecting his experience and honoring his resilience. They understood that each update carried not just information, but emotional gravity. As more details surfaced, Bob learned pieces of the truth that had been hidden since the summer of 1989. He learned that strangers had stepped forward, that people who once stayed silent were finally speaking, and that the case that once seemed hopeless was now full of life. The cold case team was determined, and they were closing in. By now, The investigation had a reconstructed timeline, multiple corroborating statements, a known last location, a missing personal item still unaccounted for, witnesses connecting key individuals to the scene. The cold case team held internal meetings to determine whether the evidence had reached the point of action. They reviewed interview transcripts, statements gathered over decades, maps, forensic reports, and behavioral analyses from profiling specialists. The question became clear: do we have enough to move forward? Investigators knew that decades-old cases require strong foundations to bring to court, but they also knew they were closer than ever before. The pieces were aligning. The path was narrowing. The truth was within reach, and the next steps would determine everything. The cold case task force gathered in a quiet conference room inside the Michigan State Police headquarters. Folders were stacked across the table. Timeline charts lined the wall. Photographs, maps, and interview summaries created a mosaic of the past. This meeting was the moment investigators had been working toward for years. They reviewed every detail: the teenage group dynamics, the evolving timeline, the recollections of Lindsay, Jenny, and Dean, the inconsistencies in the original accounts, the missing class ring, the placement of vehicles in secluded areas, and the final known location in the forest. Each point was supported by independent testimony. Each testimony aligned with physical evidence and time frames. This case, once cold and silent, now had a heartbeat. Investigators were confident. They had enough information to move forward. But the question remained: would it be enough to stand the test of the courtroom? Cold case investigations often rely on something modern cases do not: memory. In 1989, forensic technology was far more limited. DNA standards were different. Evidence collection procedures were less advanced. And many types of trace materials simply were not analyzed the same way they would be today. The cold case team had to work creatively, using behavioral profiling, witness corroboration, movement patterns, and reconstructed timelines. They reviewed every detail of the forest discovery site, looking for anything that could still offer insight. Even after all these years, certain environmental clues, the location, the arrangement of the surroundings, the accessibility of the area helped confirm that the event was not random. It was local, intentional, and connected to the individuals who knew that forest better than most. The detectives now understood the story of that night. They understood the dynamics. They understood the choices. And they were ready for the next step. The cold case team arranged a meeting with the county prosecutor. This was the defining moment, the point where a case stops being an investigation and becomes a potential prosecution. In the meeting, detectives presented their findings carefully: the timeline, the testimony from witnesses, the missing class ring, the statements placing key individuals in the forest, and the evidence contradicting the original claims. The prosecutor listened closely. True crime cases are not built on emotion. They are built on structure, logic, and legal weight. And in cold cases, the standard is even higher. When the presentation ended, the room fell into a momentary silence. Finally, the prosecutor nodded. The case was strong. The timeline made sense. The witnesses were credible. And although decades had passed, the story was finally clear enough to seek answers in court. This was the moment investigators had hoped for. They were moving forward. With approval to proceed, the task force prepared meticulously. They understood that revisiting the past after so long can be emotionally difficult for everyone involved: witnesses, families, even the suspects themselves. Detectives revisited witnesses, confirming facts and ensuring clarity. They documented each connection thoroughly, and they approached every step with respect, knowing that families and individuals had lived with these memories for decades. Some witnesses were nervous. Some were relieved. Some felt an unexpected sense of closure simply by telling the truth. But all of them understood the importance of their cooperation. For Shannon, for her family, for the truth. One of the most remarkable aspects of this cold case was the community's involvement. People who had once been unsure or afraid now came forward with openness and honesty. Some offered small details that helped fill gaps. Others provided emotional context that shaped investigators' understanding of the relationships involved. The cold case team often says that no piece of information is too small, and this investigation proved that undeniably. A single sentence overheard in a parked car. A sighting on a dark road. A memory of seeing someone in an unusual place. A thought someone pushed aside decades earlier. All of these became threads that, when woven together, made the truth unbreakable. This unity, this shared determination, breathed life into a case that had once been written off as unsolvable. With all the evidence assembled, detectives created a final reconstruction of the night. They mapped it minute by minute, where Shannon had been seen, when she was last with friends, what time she left with the brothers, when witnesses observed unusual behavior, where vehicles were parked, how far the forest trail extended, and when the final sightings occurred. From this reconstruction, one conclusion became undeniable. Shannon never returned home that night. She did not simply vanish. She encountered danger, confusion, and fear, and the people around her did not take proper steps to ensure her safety. The choices made by various individuals created the circumstances that led to the tragedy. This was no longer rumor or speculation. This was a timeline supported by evidence. And with that, the cold case team turned its attention to one last critical phase, bringing the truth into the open. As the investigation moved closer to legal action, the community began to feel the impact. People who had lived with unanswered questions for decades were suddenly revisiting old feelings. Friends of Shannon reflected on the moments they once took for granted, the laughter, the energy, the presence she brought into every room. Her classmates remembered her kindness. Her neighbors remembered her warmth. Her father remembered everything. The prospect of resolution, even after so long, brought a mixture of relief and sorrow. Closure does not erase loss. Justice does not erase pain. But they offer something important: understanding. And that was something Shannon's family had waited many years for. Investigators knew this moment carried a heavy emotional toll. For Shannon's father, a man who had dedicated his entire life to finding answers, this was the beginning of a long-awaited truth. For the community who had once whispered about possibilities, this was a moment of reckoning. And for the witnesses who had struggled with memories for decades, this was a chance to finally release the weight they had carried. As the cold case team prepared its final reports, emotions ran deep. People cried for Shannon. People prayed for her family. People hoped the truth would finally bring peace. What had once been a silent story hidden in the woods was now a story shared by a community determined not to forget. With their findings organized and the prosecutor's approval secured, investigators prepared for the legal phase of the case. They knew the road ahead would require strength, clarity, and patience. But they also knew they were moving with purpose. The truth, long obscured by fear, silence, and time, was no longer buried. Shannon's story was finally coming to light. And for the first time in decades, there was hope. After months of preparation, thousands of pages of documentation, and nearly 25 years of unanswered questions, the Cold Case Task Force made a decision that would shift the entire community's attention. They went public. Michigan State Police held a press briefing. Detectives announced that the long-unsolved disappearance of 18-year-old Shannon Siders had been reopened as an active investigation. The announcement sent a ripple through Newaygo and surrounding counties. For some, it was a shock. For others, it was long overdue. And for many, it reopened memories they had quietly tucked away for decades. But for Shannon's father, Bob, the moment carried deeper meaning than anyone else could comprehend. This was the validation he had waited for. Proof that his daughter's story still mattered. Proof that she had not been forgotten. And proof that the truth was finally being pursued with renewed determination. News spread quickly. Radio stations, newspapers, local TV broadcasts, community meetings, living rooms, grocery store aisles. People who hadn't spoken about the case in years found themselves revisiting old conversations. Some remembered details they hadn't thought of since 1989. Others felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Cold cases stir more than curiosity, they stir conscience. People began questioning their own memories. Did I see something that night? Did I hear something strange? Did I dismiss something that mattered? The task force received calls, dozens of them. Some were small recollections. Some were larger, previously unheard stories. Some came from individuals who had moved away and never expected to talk about Newaygo again. Each call mattered. Each memory added another layer of clarity. The community, once silent, had become part of the investigation. With the public announcement strengthening momentum, detectives revisited the most important witnesses: Jenny, Dean, Lindsay, members of the original social group, others who had hovered at the edges of the story. These follow-ups were essential. Witnesses often remember more when they feel safe, supported, and understood. And now, after decades of uncertainty, many were finally ready to share every detail they had once hesitated to voice. Jenny elaborated on the parked car she remembered. Dean clarified the sequence of events on the forest road. Lindsay expanded on her memory of the class ring and the strange comment connected to it. The more investigators listened, the more consistent the overall picture became. Stories that once seemed vague or incomplete now aligned with each other with remarkable accuracy. The truth was forming not from one witness, but from many. Cold case specialists understand something crucial. Character informs credibility. They took the time to explore the backgrounds and personal histories of each witness, not to judge, but to understand. They looked at who had stayed in town, who had moved away, who had struggled, who had built stable lives, who had been honest in past interviews, and who had been hesitant. Through this process, detectives built a clearer understanding of the social landscape surrounding Shannon's last night. Some witnesses were soft-spoken but reliable. Some were emotional but sincere. Some were factual and unwavering. Character consistency strengthened the credibility of their accounts. And, in cold cases, credibility is everything. The task force consulted behavioral analysts, specialists trained to examine patterns, relationships, and motivations. They reviewed teenage social dynamics, risk factors, emotional reactions, statements given shortly after the disappearance, the way certain individuals behaved in the weeks that followed. Analysts studied which stories remained consistent over the years and which ones changed, who volunteered information easily, who seemed guarded, who deflected questions, who minimized their role in events that night. These insights helped investigators understand which accounts aligned with the emerging timeline and which accounts raised new questions. Behavioral analysis confirmed what the task force already suspected. Some people had told the truth from the beginning. Some had withheld pieces of it, and others had not told it at all. The renewed investigation brought investigators back to the red pine forest once again, not to find new physical evidence, but to gain insight into the events of that night. With modern mapping tools, the task force created a digital reconstruction of the area. Topographical layers, road access points, visibility angles, distances between vehicles and clearings, walking paths that existed in the late 80s. This reconstruction allowed investigators to answer critical questions. How long would it take someone to walk from the road to the clearing? How far would a person's voice carry? Could headlights be seen through the trees? Would someone approaching from the road be visible? The forest, once confusing and vast, now became understandable. Investigators could visualize how the night unfolded with remarkable clarity. And, importantly, they could demonstrate that the events described by witnesses were both possible and consistent with the geography. This strengthened the case even further. Cold cases often focus on documents and testimony, but this case was different. It carried a deep human story. Detectives visited Bob frequently. They updated him carefully, respectfully, and with compassion. They understood. He had lost his only daughter. He had carried this loss alone for years, and he had never stopped searching for answers. Bob's dedication inspired every person on the task force. It reminded them why cold cases matter, why truth matters, why persistence matters. Each step forward in the investigation felt like a step toward giving a devoted father the answers he deserved. Bob did not ask for sympathy. He asked for truth. And now, for the first time since 1989, the truth was coming into focus. As the investigation neared the point of formal action, detectives reached out to one last group of witnesses. Individuals who had been hesitant earlier, individuals who had been difficult to reach, individuals who had once declined to speak. But with the case publicly reopened and the community supportive, many of these individuals finally chose to come forward. Their new statements did not contradict the case. They confirmed it. Certain patterns, locations, and behaviors repeated across multiple accounts, even when witnesses had no contact with each other for decades. That consistency gave investigators something essential: confidence. Confidence that they understood the truth. Confidence that the story had been correctly reconstructed. Confidence that the time had come to move to the next phase. Detectives compiled all final reports, full timeline reconstruction, all corroborating witness statements, relationship mapping, behavioral analysis summaries, digital forest reconstructions, historical context, and a detailed narrative of the night's events. They cross-checked every detail. They reviewed every question the prosecutor might ask in court. They prepared their findings methodically, carefully, and professionally. The Cold Case Task Force had done what many believed was impossible. They had rebuilt the truth from memories, courage, and persistence. Now, the case had to move from investigation to accountability. The community watched closely. Bob waited quietly. Investigators prepared for the next step. The long-buried truth was finally ready to come forward. The Cold Case Task Force presented their completed findings to the prosecutor's office. This time, the presentation was not a hopeful request. It was a compelling, organized, evidence-supported case. And after a detailed review, the prosecutor agreed. This case had the depth, strength, and clarity required to move forward. It was time. After decades of silence, after years of uncertainty, after countless sleepless nights for a grieving father, the truth had finally found its voice. And the next chapter would take place where the story had always belonged. In the courtroom. The moment the prosecutor agreed to move the case forward, the Cold Case Task Force felt a mixture of relief and determination. They knew the fight ahead would be long, complex, and emotionally demanding, but they also knew it was necessary. For Shannon, for Bob, for the truth. The investigation was no longer a quiet pursuit. It was a mission preparing to enter a public arena, one where every detail would be scrutinized. And investigators were ready. Cold case prosecutions require extraordinary preparation. Decades-old cases depend heavily on witness testimony, timelines, behavioral patterns, credibility, and consistent recollections. No single witness could tell the entire story, but together, their memories created a clear narrative of the night Shannon disappeared. Narrator. Detectives worked closely with prosecutors to organize chronological events, supporting testimonies, maps and diagrams, historical context, and logical sequencing. They created a detailed storyboard of the events, ensuring every part of the narrative was supported by independent evidence. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing was guessed. Nothing was exaggerated. This documentary-style reconstruction of the truth had to be airtight. And it was. News of the renewed case spread across Newaygo County. People who had lived in the area since the late 1980s felt the weight of history pressing forward. People who were teenagers back then now watched as adults, parents, grandparents, teachers, business owners. They had grown, changed, and moved forward with life. But Shannon's absence had always lingered in the collective memory of the community. Now, with the possibility of answers at hand, old conversations re-emerged. Where you're, money will you're, now where you're by, will you're by, now where you're by, will you're by, will you're by, will you're by, in another mention, will you're by, will you're by, will you're by, will you're by, will you're by. I remember that summer. I remember seeing something unusual. I always wondered what really happened. It became clear that this was more than a criminal case. It was a community reckoning, a moment of truth for a town that had carried unanswered questions for far too long. Investigators understood that witnesses would face emotional challenges when asked to testify. These were people who had lived with memories, some painful, some confusing, some frightening, for over 20 years. Detectives prepared them carefully, explaining what to expect, helping them understand their importance, listening to their concerns, reassuring them that truth comes from honesty, not perfection. Many witnesses expressed nerves. Some expressed relief. Others felt a sense of duty they hadn't recognized until now. And all understood one thing. Their testimony could help finally reveal what happened to a young woman whose life had been cut short. Courage takes many forms. Sometimes it looks like standing up in a courtroom. Sometimes it looks like telling a painful truth. And sometimes it looks like breaking a silence that has lasted most of a lifetime. The cold case investigation revealed that courage does not always come quickly. Sometimes it arrives slowly, shaped by maturity, reflection, and the desire to do what is right. Witnesses who had once been teenagers now step forward as adults with families of their own, responsibilities of their own, and perspectives shaped by decades of life experience. Their courage became a cornerstone of the case. Their honesty helped construct the narrative, and their willingness to speak was one of the most powerful elements of the renewed investigation. Without them, the truth would have remained hidden. Throughout the preparation process, detectives took time to learn more about Shannon from those who knew her best. They heard stories from friends, neighbors, classmates, and, of course, from her father, Bob. She was remembered as bright, curious, caring, full of youthful energy, a young woman with dreams and possibilities. Shannon was not just a name in a case file. She was a daughter, a friend, a part of the community. Her legacy became the emotional anchor of the investigation, a reminder of why persistence mattered, why truth mattered, and why justice mattered. Detectives often said that when their work became difficult, they thought of Bob's dedication and Shannon's future, a future she never had the chance to live. Their story fueled the task force's determination. The prosecutor and detectives collaborated to finalize the list of witnesses needed for court. They chose individuals who had first-hand knowledge, had credible recollections, could speak to the timeline, or could describe the social dynamics of the group. The list included friends who saw Shannon earlier that evening, individuals who interacted with the group, people who saw unusual behavior that night, witnesses who remembered significant comments, those who placed specific individuals in the forest area. Every witness on the list had a specific purpose to help the jury understand the events of that night clearly, logically, and honestly. Together, they formed a narrative that made sense, even after decades. The cold case task force understood that pursuing justice was a responsibility, not just a mission. They weren't simply seeking answers for the sake of the case. They were honoring the life of a young woman whose story deserved resolution. They approached the case with respect, respecting the memory shared, respecting the emotional toll, respecting the family's pain, respecting the importance of truth. Their responsibility was not only to solve a mystery, but to ensure that the truth was presented with dignity. Every step taken was deliberate and thoughtful, because they knew the world would be watching, and the family would be listening, and the memory of Shannon deserved nothing less. Months of work culminated in the assembly of the final case file, a complete timeline, supporting testimonies, key interactions, reconstructed movement paths, analysis reports, credibility assessments, and a narrative supported by multiple independent sources. Investigators reviewed it again and again, making sure there were no gaps. They asked themselves, is this fair? Is this honest? Is this supported by evidence? Is this strong enough to stand after 20 years? The answer to each question was yes. The final case file was more than an investigation. It was a carefully woven story of truth, courage, and persistence. And now, it was ready to be presented. With the case file complete and the prosecutor officially committed to moving forward, the next phase became clear. The reopening was now becoming a formal legal process. Investigators had done everything they could. The truth had been reconstructed. The witnesses had been prepared. The community was informed. The courtroom would test the work of the cold case team. But investigators were ready. They had built a strong, respectful, evidence-based narrative. Shannon's story was no longer a mystery trapped in the past. It was now a case heading toward resolution, and for the first time in over 2 decades, the path toward justice was open. Time can complicate an investigation, but it can also clarify it. Decades after Shannon's disappearance, the voices that once hesitated now spoke with conviction. People who had once been teenagers had grown into adults, shaped by responsibility and reflection. The passage of time gave them perspective and the courage to break the silence. Every cold case investigator knows this truth. Sometimes justice is achieved, not despite the years passing, but because of them. And now, with the investigation complete and the narrative clear, the next step was set. Presenting the truth. Once the prosecutor decided to move forward, local law enforcement worked carefully to prepare the community. Announcements were made with sensitivity. A respectful tone was maintained throughout. The goal was not to stir fear or gossip, but to acknowledge the seriousness of the case and the importance of the legal process. Residents of Newaygo understood the gravity of the moment. Some had known Shannon personally. Others remembered the days following her disappearance. And many had watched the story fade from public conversation, only now to see it return with renewed purpose. This was no longer just an old story. It was an unfolding chapter of justice. To prepare fully, the Cold Case Task Force needed to collaborate with state prosecutors, legal analysts, courtroom specialists, victim advocates. They walked through every detail of the case, ensuring that evidence was presented respectfully and clearly. The legal process would demand patience, pre-trial briefings, motions, lists of evidence, witness preparation, legal strategy sessions. But investigators remained confident. Their case was built on consistency, corroboration, and truth, not speculation. This was the strongest the case had ever been. Through every step, Shannon's father, Bob, showed remarkable strength. He met with detectives calmly. He listened to updates with quiet determination. He offered memories of Shannon with tenderness and clarity. But beneath that quiet strength was a lifetime of grief. Detectives knew that reliving these memories was not easy for him. Every meeting reopened old wounds. Every new detail reminded him of the daughter he had raised alone, the daughter he had waited for every day, the daughter who never came home. Bob never asked for revenge. He asked for truth, for justice, for acknowledgement of what his daughter endured. And now, after years of carrying the weight of uncertainty, he felt something different: hope. Before taking the case to a public courtroom, prosecutors held a series of internal meetings, reviewing each witness statement, assessing credibility, cross-checking timelines, rehearsing presentation order, anticipating defense questions, planning how to explain the decades-old investigation to a jury. Every detail mattered. The team knew they would be presenting a story that stretched across nearly a quarter of a century. They needed clarity. They needed coherence. And most of all, they needed compassion. Shannon's story was painful, and it was essential to tell it with dignity. The prosecutor's office approached the case with professionalism and care, mindful that every word spoken in the courtroom would echo through the lives of those involved. Cold cases are more than unfinished files. They are unfinished lives. They represent unanswered questions, unspoken truths, families waiting for closure, communities haunted by what remains unresolved. In Shannon's case, the stakes were deeply human. She was a young woman with her entire life ahead of her. She was loved. She was valued. She deserved justice. Investigators were driven not by the pursuit of punishment, but by the pursuit of truth. That truth, once scattered and hidden, had finally become clear. And now it was ready to be heard. As legal preparations intensified, something remarkable happened in Newaygo. The community began to heal. People who had once avoided discussing the case now spoke openly and with compassion. People reconnected with old friends they hadn't seen in years. People reached out to Bob, offering words of comfort and support. Healing often begins when silence ends, and in this case, silence had lasted far too long. The renewed investigation gave the community permission to reflect, remember, and speak. It reopened conversations that had been closed since the summer of 1989. This was more than legal action. It was community restoration. Investigators reflected on the journey that brought them to this point. Years of frustration, years of searching, years of caring for a story that many believed would never be understood. Yet here they were. The truth had not come from a single moment, but from hundreds of small ones. A memory shared, a statement clarified, a detail remembered, a witness overcoming fear, a father refusing to give up. Truth is rarely loud. It is built quietly, piece by piece, by those willing to speak when it matters most. And now, that truth was strong enough to stand before the world. For the first time in many years, Shannon's name was spoken openly throughout Newaygo. In living rooms, in conversations at work, in local gatherings, in quiet moments of reflection. She became more than a headline from the past. She became a symbol of perseverance. Her story reminded people that justice can be delayed, but it cannot be silenced forever. People who never knew Shannon found themselves moved by her story. People who had known her remembered her smile, her warmth, her potential. Shannon became a unifying force, bringing together investigators, witnesses, community members, and her grieving father. Her life mattered. Her story mattered. And now, her voice was being heard again. With the final preparations complete, the case was ready for the next step. A step that would occur in the one place designed to uncover the truth: the courtroom. Detectives knew the road ahead would not be easy. Cold cases are challenging. Memories can be tested. Time can blur details. But they also knew they had something powerful: consistency, courage, community support, and a narrative supported by the voices of many. They were ready. And as the final phase approached, the cold case team gathered for one last meeting. A quiet moment of unity and reflection. Their goal was never to reopen old wounds, but to bring long-delayed justice to a young woman who deserved it. The path was set, and the truth, once buried in silence, was finally ready to stand in the light. The courthouse that once felt like a distant possibility was now the next destination for a case that had traveled through decades. Officials, clerks, and attorneys prepared for what would be one of the most meaningful legal proceedings the community had seen in years. Inside the courthouse, there was a quiet awareness. People understood the weight of what was coming. This was not simply a legal matter, it was the reopening of a wound that had shaped a town's history. The halls were lined with polished floors and soft echoes. Files were carried from office to office. Meeting rooms filled with the sound of whispered discussions and careful planning. For the first time since 1989, the truth was moving toward a formal stage, toward a space where evidence, testimony, and memory could be laid out openly. The courtroom, long silent on Shannon's case, was preparing to hear her story. Before entering the legal phase, each witness involved in the case was contacted with compassion and clarity. They were told, gently, what to expect. The questions, the process, the atmosphere, the reality that sharing memories publicly may feel intimidating. Many expressed nervousness, a natural response to revisiting the past under public scrutiny. But something remarkable happened. Witnesses who once feared speaking up now stood taller, ready to share what they remembered. They understood their importance. They understood their responsibility. They understood that their voice might help bring long-awaited answers. Some described the experience as emotional. Others felt a sense of duty. Many said they finally felt ready to speak without hesitation. Courage had grown with time. The prosecution team began crafting a narrative that would be presented clearly and respectfully. They compiled the timeline, supporting testimony, behavioral patterns, social context, movement mapping, and the forest route reconstruction. Their strategy was simple yet powerful: to tell the truth, not with dramatization, not with speculation, but with evidence, consistency, and honesty. The strength of the case lay in its structure. No single witness held the entire story. But together, their memories formed a picture so consistent that it became undeniable. The prosecution knew jurors would examine every detail carefully. They ensured that every detail they presented would be supported by independent evidence. Nothing was included unless it was certain. While the prosecution strengthened its narrative, defense attorneys prepared their own strategies. They reviewed decades-old police reports. They examined early statements from 1989. They studied every possible inconsistency or gap created by time. It is the defense's duty to test the strength of a case, especially a cold case. But investigators and prosecutors felt confident. They believed the structure of the truth was strong enough to stand against scrutiny. Still, they prepared for every possibility, ensuring timelines were accurate, statements were consistent, and witnesses were ready. The courtroom would challenge every piece of information, and preparation was everything. As the trial approached, an unusual energy filled the town of Newaygo. People remembered where they were the summer Shannon disappeared. People recalled the search efforts. People thought about how young they had been and how much had changed since then. Conversations resurfaced everywhere, at work, at home, at church gatherings, at community events, in quiet moments with old friends. For many, it felt like the past had returned, carrying both grief and healing. Some residents expressed hope. Some expressed anxiety. Some expressed relief that the truth would soon be openly acknowledged. No matter their feelings, one thing united them: the importance of honoring Shannon. One of the cold case team's strongest advantages was the consistency of witness statements across decades. Different people, from different backgrounds, with different memories, all described events that aligned with the timeline, the location, and the behavior of key individuals. This consistency became the backbone of the case. Witnesses who had not spoken to each other in decades corroborated one another unknowingly. Memories once dismissed as insignificant suddenly became meaningful. Moments long buried resurfaced with clarity. The truth, once scattered, had finally come together. Investigators understood something crucial. Justice is not only about evidence. It is about integrity. They ensured that every piece of information in the case was handled with respect not only for Shannon, but for everyone involved. This meant avoiding assumptions, avoiding exaggeration, avoiding sensationalism, and avoiding anything that could compromise the dignity of the case. Integrity guided every decision, every interview, every document, every meeting with the prosecutor. The case was not built on emotion. It was built on truth. Before the court phase officially began, the cold case task force gathered for one final internal meeting. They sat together: the detectives, the analysts, the prosecutors, the specialists. On the table were files, photographs, diagrams, maps, and transcripts. They reviewed the narrative one last time: Shannon's last day, the group dynamics, the timeline reconstruction, the eyewitness accounts, the forest location, and the final collection of statements. Every part of the story was supported. Every detail had meaning. Every voice had contributed to the truth. It had taken decades to reach this moment, and now they were ready to move forward. This case was never just about a courtroom decision. It was about a daughter's memory, a father's perseverance, a community's healing, and the power of truth emerging after years of silence. The cold case team understood that whatever happened in the courtroom, one thing was already accomplished. Shannon's story had been restored. She was no longer a missing person. She was no longer a cold case file. She was a young woman whose truth had finally been heard. Her voice, once silenced by time, was now louder than ever. The morning the courtroom opened for the case, people gathered quietly outside. There were no loud crowds, no chaotic scenes, just a solemn understanding of the gravity of what was about to unfold. Reporters stood respectfully distant. Community members watched quietly. Witnesses prepared themselves with deep breaths, and Bob, Shannon's father, walked forward with quiet courage. Narrator. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was still. A judge took their seat. Attorneys organized their notes. Investigators sat together, united in purpose. And the jury, 12 strangers, prepared to listen. For the first time in over 2 decades, Shannon's story was about to be told openly, respectfully, and truthfully. The courtroom, silent and focused, became the stage for a moment the community had waited for since the summer of 1989. The pursuit of truth, the pursuit of justice, the pursuit of closure was finally beginning. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy with anticipation. After years of unanswered questions, years of memories held privately, and years of one father's unwavering hope, the truth was ready to be spoken. The prosecution began by laying out the timeline reconstructed by the Cold Case Task Force, where Shannon was last seen, who she was last with, where the group traveled, and how the events of that night pointed toward one conclusion. Maps were presented. Voice recordings from interviews were played. Photographs of the forest area were shown respectful, clean, and purely contextual. The jury leaned forward, listening carefully as the story unfolded. Witness after witness stepped forward. Some spoke softly, their voices shaking under the weight of decades-old memories. Some spoke clearly, confident now that their truth mattered. Some paused often, collecting themselves as they revisited one of the most difficult nights of their youth. Their testimonies did not contradict one another. They confirmed one another. The scattered fragments from 1989 had become a cohesive narrative, held together by courage and clarity. As testimony continued, something powerful happened inside the courtroom. People who once felt divided by silence now found unity through truth. Former classmates sat quietly in support. Community members who remembered the original search efforts offered comfort to Bob. Witnesses, though nervous, felt strength in knowing they were no longer carrying these memories alone. The courtroom did not feel like a battleground. It felt like a place of acknowledgement, accountability, and long overdue voices finally being heard. And at the center of it all was Shannon's father, a man who had waited more than half his life for this moment. Bob listened to every witness. He watched every chart presented. He studied every timeline projected on the screen. Behind his quiet expression was a lifetime of love, grief, and resilience. He had promised himself he would never give up. And now, in a courtroom filled with truth, he had kept that promise. One of the most moving aspects of the court phase was the realization that memory, though imperfect, can still be incredibly powerful. A simple statement from one witness aligned with a recollection from another. A sighting remembered by one person fit perfectly into the timeline of someone else. A moment once dismissed as unimportant suddenly became essential. Small truths became big truths. Quiet memories became key evidence. Courage became clarity. The courtroom saw firsthand how a community's collective memory, once scattered in silence, could come together to reveal a story that had been hidden in plain sight. It proved that time may pass, but truth can still endure. As the prosecution presented its final summary, the story came full circle. A father returning home from a night shift, a silent house, a missing daughter, a summer night filled with unanswered questions, a group of teenagers whose memories became the key to reconstruction, a forest that held the truth for decades, and a dedicated task force determined to uncover that truth without sensationalism or speculation. The prosecutor's tone remained respectful, steady, and centered on the facts. No sensational claims, no graphic descriptions, only the truth. The defense offered its closing statement as well, firm but professional. But as the attorneys finished, the room felt different. There was no tension, no hostility. Just a community acknowledging a truth it had waited so long to understand. When the proceedings concluded, there was a sense of release in the room, a quiet, emotional acknowledgement that something long overdue had finally taken place. The court had heard the story. The evidence had been presented. The witnesses had found their voice, and Shannon's truth had finally been spoken with dignity. For Bob, it was not the end of grief. Grief never ends for a parent, but it was the end of uncertainty, the end of silence, the end of carrying the weight of unanswered questions alone. His daughter's story had been honored. Her name had been spoken with respect. Her truth had become part of the community's memory permanently. Newaygo would never forget Shannon again. As the courtroom emptied and the lights dimmed, the impact of the case lived on, not just in legal records, but in hearts, homes, and history. Shannon's story teaches us something essential. Truth may wait, but it does not disappear. People may hesitate, but courage can grow. And justice, no matter how delayed, can still find its way forward. Thank you for joining us on this journey through a case that took decades to understand. Shannon Siders' story reminds us why persistence matters, why truth matters, and why every voice can make a difference. If you found this documentary meaningful, please like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to support more real-life stories that deserve to be heard.